I have a young friend who recently graduated cum laude from one of our engineering schools. He has started out in life conquering and to conquer. As is not uncommon with young men in their middle 20s these days, his automobile is his dearest possession. He gets up at the most amazing hours to polish it and to make sure that not one speck of dust mars its beauty. At the same time, being an engineer, he has come to a series of rather dramatic conclusions. He has decided that automobile companies do not know how to build cars, that the car can be of very little value until he has rebuilt it. So a part of his project is to keep this car in an ever-increasing level of efficiency. He works on it almost constantly in his spare time. There is something always wrong with the shock absorbers, the ignition, or the upholstery. Something has to be done to it every minute. Also, he has come to the conclusion that most of the refining companies do not know how to make gasoline. As a result of that, he is constantly changing from one brand to another. One day he tells all his friends and everyone in the neighborhood that a certain type of gasoline is super. 2 weeks later, he wouldn't put a tank full of it in his car for love or money. He is disillusioned. He has now gone through nearly all the major and minor brands, and he is still disillusioned. Little by little, the problem of his car has become pretty much of a fixation with him. He is constantly fooling with it. And as a result of his years of engineering training, of his constant attention, and his continual anxiety, his car is about the poorest running one in the neighborhood. Now this is a more or less a useful lesson in many areas of life. We have discovered through years of research and ponderation that we can overdo matters on which we put too much attention. Now it is also very easy to neglect something out of existence. But somewhere there is a moderate ground, and this moderate ground has to do with efficiency and with the maximum probabilities of things working reasonably well. Now, 25 years ago, we went to the family physician and suggested that we would like to go on a diet. He would very benignly reach into one of the compartments of his filing system and bring out an 8.5 by 11-inch sheet of typewriting paper, on it being a diet list. He would hand this to us with a blessing like, "May God have mercy upon your soul," and suggest that we follow the instructions carefully, come in periodically for a check to see if we were still alive, and let nature take its course. Today it is all different. Instead of reaching for that diet sheet, the up-to-date physician reaches for his ballpoint pen and writes us a prescription. His prescription may be one of many different products, possibly the sample of which arrived in the mail that morning. These materials are very largely prescriptions for our convenience. The primary purpose of nearly all prescriptions involving diet is that they shall be appetite killers. The individual finds it very difficult to maintain an optimistic attitude on dieting while his stomach is crawling around urging for food. Therefore, the first problem in this pattern is to put the stomach to sleep. Now, this is itself quite a little trick because it's very hard to completely isolate this organ. It's very hard to put the stomach completely at peace with itself and its neighbors without also paralyzing the intestinal tract. Little by little, the use of these various dietetic sedations and food munchers tranquilizers. The use of these may have, and probably will have, some rather unusual byproduct effects. Not long ago, I made a little examination of the literature sent out by one of our larger pharmaceutical houses, in which a whole group of new drugs, unpronounceable by name and unintelligible to the average physician who receives the list, concerning various recommended new products. In small type, at the end of each product was, under some conditions, certain unexpected results or effects may arise. The individual might, if he is 1 in 50, have a complete collapse after taking 5 doses. In other words, for 49 people, the immediate use of the remedy has had no bad effects. The 50th person had convulsions. Another remedy says that normally this particular product is indicated in the treatment of this, but occasionally it produces hives. Another case is, it seems to work all right, but in some instances we have noted a sharp rise in blood pressure. Still another recommendation says that blood pressure went down in a few cases until the user had to be taken to the hospital in an ambulance. These drugs, regardless of how we study them or consider them, come to the physician with a recommendation of reputable research chemists. These research chemists have probably done a pretty thorough job in trying to check the immediate effect of certain medications. They have, however, no way of checking the long-term effect. No one has. If the effect is cyclic and the patient does not receive the impact of the effect for 5 years, by that time he has forgotten he ever took the drug. By that time also other symptoms and complications have risen in his life, and even the most careful physician will never diagnose the ailment back again to the drug. So having started out on some course of procedure, the individual must hope that he is not one of the 10 or 15% who may be expected to react badly to very many of our so-called wonder drugs. So many are reacting badly at the moment, the number of these drugs are grouped together today as blunder drugs. And the results of taking them the results are being given much more cautious and thoughtful attention than ever before. The physician is in no way capable of determining from his own experience these drugs. A friend of mine had a doctor, however, who was a very conscientious man. He never prescribed anything that he didn't take himself. This was quite an ordeal, no doubt, in some instances. It's a pity the poor man didn't survive, but he passed on in the midst of his conscientiousness. So we have these problems to think about. And today, where the average person is, shall we say, soft, where he's not likely to want to endure any discomfort whatever to achieve any end which he may want, the problem of making any major change in his personal chemistry without any discomfort is a pretty serious one, and one which I think we ought to give a little consideration to. Man has been interested in food since the beginning of his history. In fact, he has never done very well without it. And from the earliest time, food has been related to religion and to philosophy. As far back as we know, religious and philosophical movements have had certain dietetic recommendations. Food and faith have always been very close to each other in their psychological impacts. From the earliest time, the principal form of dietetic involvement between religion and food was the concept of fasting. There is hardly a religion known to the world that has not practiced or advocated fasting for one reason or another. And there are also very few religions that have not placed some restrictions upon food. In some instances, as in the old Jewish, food was considered clean or unclean, and unclean food was not suitable for the use of the people. In Moslemism, faith of Muhammad, various fast days, prohibitions of certain foods also are to be noted. And throughout Christendom we have had, in the earliest century certainly, great emphasis upon restriction of food. We know the Greeks also practiced it, and we know that among the Greeks, Pythagoras of Samos was quite an expert on the use of food, not only in terms of its nutritional values, but as a medication. Also then we come to realize that, all things considered, food was not only the first necessary nutrition of man, but also probably his first medicine. All food has certain medical or medicinal power. Food is not something that merely sustains the body, regardless of what type of food intake we permit. Food has special chemical action. Things that we eat are not all alike, and each type of food has some specific or special effect upon our body and by indirection upon our psychic integration. Today we are confronted with a number of problems that seem to directly or indirectly relate to food. And so we want to talk about some of them and see if we can find out what we are dealing with. There are three ways in which we can level off food intake. We can speak of the individual who does not eat enough. We can speak of the individual whose diet is approximately normal, reasonable, and proper. And we can speak of the person whose diet is excessive, or in whose diet certain elements which are not necessary or desirable are excessively consumed. Normally speaking, the normal diet is probably the one that we should all strive for. And we should strive for this not only because of its normalcy, but because it is that type of diet which seems to require the least amount of mental attention. The moment we have to throw our thoughts and emotions strongly upon our food, we are going to have trouble. The individual who is unaware of his diet but eats reasonably is the one who may expect to have the best results from food and the best general health in life. In the religious phase of food problem, we realize that fasting and days of abstinence were the most common religious rules. We know that in the Old Testament nearly all of the saints and patriarchs of ancient times are reported to have gone into the deserts and there to have fasted and prayed, meditated, and sought communion with God. Almost always these religious sessions were accompanied by reduction of food intake. The reason being that, according to a very beautiful phrase used in a book recently by Mr. Yanagi, these practices had come from the common experience of the neighborhood. It was something that had to do with man's own internal realization of what was necessary to him. The most primitive peoples have practiced fasting. Peoples that have had no contact with more cultivated or sophisticated races still follow the old custom. When a person was in a great emergency, when he needed spiritual consolation or insight, he dedicated himself to some process of meditation which included the reduction of his food intake. The common experience arising from this is rather physically demonstrable today, namely that the reduction of food inevitably results in a greater psychic sensitivity. This psychic sensitivity is probably due to the reduction of toxin in the body. It may also be due to the reduction of certain types of food element, particularly sugar, in the brain. Whatever may be the cause of it, from a highly chemical point of view, there is no real agreement even now as to just what happens. We know that under extreme food reduction, the individual is more likely to have extrasensory experience, or at least an experience which he regards as extrasensory. This brings into focus, therefore, a psychological problem which very well could have a bearing upon our present condition. If the reduction of food has a tendency to make the individual hypersensitive, if it has a tendency to cause the individual to lose certain insulation by which his psychic nature is impaired or impeded in its expression, then the lack of food or the reduction of food may and usually does result in a series of symptoms, one of the first of which is increasing nervousness and increasing or exhilarated nerve tension. Also, the individual under sharp food reduction is very much more likely to become depressed psychologically, and out of this depression to create a series of fantasies or delusions or illusions, or to come under a negative phase of his own psychic life. Now, among primitive people, this result was almost certainly present also. And if we look back on the early history of our own religion, we realize that somewhere in the beginning of it, there were some rather neurotic individuals who apparently became sanctified through their various abstinences, but who still gave to the church a number of very unpleasant and unreasonable doctrines which it has never been able to get over. We cannot say that all of the inhibitions and frustrations of the primitive fathers led to constructive results. We also do realize, however, that among primitive people, the internal psychic load is very different from ours. If we were brought up, for example, as the ancient Jewish mystic was reared, with a full belief in the importance of mysticism, and most of all, the full conviction that we could and should live these principles in our daily lives. If our fathers lived this way, their fathers before them, if these practices were the common and proper practices of our time, we might not develop as many complexes as we are likely to do under present conditions. Furthermore, these older people were not loaded with their own frustrated ambitions. They were not burdened by a mass of psychic grievances. They were not neurotics. They were not hypochondriacs. They were rather simple people living close to nature, living a simple faith which sustained them, and facing the future without a great deal of psychic pressure. If such a person, therefore, became hypersensitive, he was very apt to become more and more aware of the realities of his own way of life. This way of life was not essentially bad in itself. It was not complicated. It was not full of frustrated ambitions. He did not expect to become famous, wealthy, or successful within a few years. He was not worried over religious doubts. His faith was his racial and national religion. He had no concept of existing outside of it or beyond it. There was no conflict between his economic theory and his religious theory. These things led to a rather placid interior, and he did not, therefore, develop the same kind of neurotic pressures that we observe to develop when we begin to relax away from our defense against the confusion of our own inner lives. So what we have to be a little careful of is what kind of a Pandora's box we are opening. If we become more sensitive, if we permit our psychic life to come nearer and nearer to the surface, and finally perhaps break through into the control of our lives, what are we going to be controlled by? The majority of instances, we are going to be controlled by inner chaos. We are going to be controlled by all kinds of neurotic frustrations and pressures. We are going to find ourselves in a very complicated situation with hallucination not very far away. Furthermore, if we are not observant and careful, we will gradually lower our physical resistance to our own mental and emotional pressures. If the body reaches a certain degree of deficiency, we always note a loss of morale. We find that the individual is less able to be happy, less able to be cheerful, just as the person who is suddenly stricken with some form of illness loses most of the joy of living, or at least during the period of sickness. We become indifferent to things which once were meaningful and important to us. So whereas in ancient times fasting was regarded as a virtue, it is very doubtful if the average person today could go into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, living on water and the herbs of the field, and come back in particularly good condition. He probably wouldn't. By the time he came back, he would not have come back inspired, enlightened, convinced that he had heard his God speak to him in the lines or something of that nature. He would probably come back hating himself and everybody else. This is due to a difference in point of view. Now, on the other hand, our ancient ancestors also realized that there was a great problem of self-control and self-discipline, which included food. That it was very good for the person to take certain discipline attitudes to himself. If he found that he was falling into gluttony, it was certainly advisable for him to change his ways. And that he should change these ways, not because of gluttony, but because lack of self-control is not good, never was good, and never will be. The complete loss of discipline and the instinct to discipline is one of the terrible disasters of our generation, and we are compounding this felony with tranquilizers. We are now making it apparently unnecessary for the individual to do anything he doesn't want to do. Instead of opposing his action with his character, he now opposes his action with some form of a somatic drug, which paralyzes his desires for a time at least. There is no victory of self over circumstance. There is simply a victory of unconsciousness over consciousness, and this is not good. So in the ancient days, certain rules and regulations were recommended. There were days of fasting. There were days in which the individual restrained himself from certain foods. The early church established its fast days and established also its period of Lent. These types of establishments were probably very well considered. They meant that at least occasionally the individual gave his body some relief, allowed a certain amount of healthful reconstruction, and we also have to realize that while we like to think that our ancestors lived close to the earth and had wonderful natural foods that we know nothing about, the general diet of our remote forebears was abominable, and it is doubtful if any except the hardiest could survive. So that the back-to-nature cult that we think of really didn't exist in a time when most meat was polluted before we ate it, where there was no refrigeration or preservation, where the arts of food were unknown, and where everything largely depended upon whether there was something available at that moment. If there was, eat it. This psychology is quite different, and we can't judge dietetics now entirely by the ancient patterns. Broadly speaking, however, we did realize long ago that the body needed certain reliefs, and that these reliefs were perhaps best expressed by the religious code. For instance, in some religions, a day of fasting was appointed every week. The Muslim preserves certain fasting at the Feast of Ramadan and other sacred occasions. Fasting for brief periods seemingly was of great value to the individual. We remember that Mohandas Gandhi fasted one day each week, and by this process alone felt that he improved and strengthened his bodily resources. So that a moderate amount of self-discipline will very often do a great deal of good. It will help the individual to be mindful of food as he is mindful of any other habit that he possesses. But I think the whole point of discipline is summed up in the words of the New Testament, where we must be more concerned about that which cometh out of the mouth than that which goeth in at the mouth. And no matter how careful we are of our diet, if we do not discipline our dispositions, we will die just as young. It is all a matter of bringing order and pattern into an otherwise chaotic state of affairs. Now, when we begin to think, therefore, in terms of food regulation, we realize that one of our problems has been that as prosperity increased, food has become a status symbol. It has become a symbol of wealth, of achievement, of success, and of all these things. And as a result of that, we have built up a vast psychic pattern of luxurious living, which is not conducive to health and not really philosophically or religiously or even scientifically sound. So that over these areas, certain natural and proper reservations will help us to increase and normalize our way of life. Today, probably, one of our great problems is that we are over-influenced by a great many symbols in society, and from this over-influence we have become the greatest food faddists recorded. It is estimated now that nearly 1/2 of the population of this country is or has been or soon will be experimenting with some kind of a diet. Most of these diets originate in newspapers, periodicals, and popular journals. A great many of them are the product of various houses producing dietetic materials and, of course, are essentially advertising. Much of our information also is back fence therapy. It is the type in which an individual says, "I lost 8 pounds, it was marvelous, you should do the same thing." This type of approach to food is to completely overlook the fact that food is life, that to interfere or to unwisely fool with diet is just as unwise as it is to grope in the dark to a medicine cabinet and start taking the contents. This type of attitude is not conducive of health. I believe that we will gradually discover that the diet fad is contributing very strongly to our psychological sickness. We wonder why it is that the rate of psychologically sick people increases every year. That in spite of the fact that we have probably more knowledge, more skill, and more remedies than ever before for the treatment of these problems, we have more sickness in these areas. Now, there are many ways that we can look at it. One way is to simply say we have never been under the stress that we are under today. Therefore, there is every reason why we should have difficulty. Another way of looking at it is that perhaps the increase is due in part to the tremendous increase in remedies, that we are becoming sick from the very medications which were intended to help us to get well. Certainly, in one way or another, the problem of health is not gaining as it should. we are approximately patching up more people than ever before, but it is not really wise to say that we are a healthier race. Nor can we necessarily point out that the comparative statistical tables that indicate that we live a little longer than our ancestors shall be regarded as the full picture of the situation. We may live longer in some ways and under certain conditions, but there is some measure of doubt as to whether we are actually living any better. And to make a longer life valuable, it must also be a better life, a life lived with greater understanding and greater enjoyment, peace, and advantage resulting from living. These products we do not seem to be developing very rapidly. The ancient generally reduced from religious causes or dieted from religious causes. The modern man attempts to control diet for one of two purposes. The average man in the effort to lengthen life, and the average woman for cosmetic purposes. These two patterns have become the dominant reasons behind what we consider now weight regulation. This problem, however, is again what it has always been and always will be, a matter of self-discipline. The moment we go outside of this to use various appetite killers and so forth, we are frustrating the essential purpose of experience, and we are taking grave danger of future trouble which cannot be diagnosed at the present time because we do not know the consequences of most of the remedies that have come into use in the last 5 to 10 years. So we should be a little careful lest out of our desperate desire to accomplish some small purpose, we also endanger the larger purposes of life. We also realize from studying a great many people that what we call today the overeating mania, which is affecting us and is gradually spreading with other forms of our way of life to people in other nations, that this mania is itself a psychological symptom. The individual is under a food compulsion because of certain other pressures within himself. To the great many people, food is an escape from certain psychoneurotic pressures which are constantly increasing in his way of life. Some individuals who would never think of taking a cocktail because they do not believe in alcohol will, however, overeat. And you will remember the classic case of William Jennings Bryan, our top prohibitionist, who died of gluttony. This type of situation is a problem in escape mechanism. The individual finds a certain relief from reality in food. He finds that food also, he believes, provides him with a certain stamina, a certain additional power with which to face problems. Therefore, inordinate eating is a symbol of the acceptance of personal weakness, the fact that the individual is unable to cope with the pressure of circumstances. He finds also that overeating perhaps helps him somewhat to sleep, to get away from the pressures of the day. So it is release from pressure primarily which is causing most of our dietetic problems in this country. Now, we also hear a great deal about the fact that the individual is living a more and more sedentary life. That as a result of lack of exercise and lack of physical activity, that he is unable to use up the food that his ancestor once used. I spent some years in early life on a western Pennsylvania farm, and I can assure you that they were not starving to death in that area. An ordinary breakfast would contain more food than we would normally eat in 3 days. And this was considered just a normal breakfast. On Sunday mornings they did much better. But nothing in those days for a breakfast to include meat, usually a large steak, probably with the meat, eggs, with the eggs in turn, homemade bread in large slabs and great stacks of hot cakes. And in order that the individual should not be deficient in anything, great bowls of cereal with full cream. This type of eating, I would imagine that the average farm breakfast in the area where I was would probably run between 5,000 and 6,000 calories. And that only started the day. By noon, they really had worked up an appetite. Yet as far as the horizon went in every direction, you seldom found an overweight person. These people, for some reason, worked off the food which they took. And even those members of the community who were not in active activity, who were not doing this work in the fields, ate the same, and they were thin also. So what is the reason for this? What is this weight situation? It can arise from a great number of different, rather complicated situations. There are racial types in weight. There are hereditary types in weight. There are various factors involved that we largely ignore when we try to streamline down to the actuary tables. Also, there seems to be one other factor that was very important to these people. Very few of them had any important mental, emotional pressures. This farming community got up at dawn, was busy all day, the men in the fields, the women in the houses. Life consisted of a constant, routine labor. Against this labor there was very little dissatisfaction. The religious life of this community was dominated by the village church, and every Sunday morning and very often Wednesday evenings, the families for 20 miles around would put on their best clothes, put a little extra goose grease on their boots, and go on into town. Here they would gather with their friends, and they would have a simple religious service. With this simple religious service, the minister, almost certainly being a country man himself, chose sermons that suggested the rural life of people. His sermons had to do with the simple acceptances of life, the glorification of God, the rearing of family, the planting of the field, and the constant attitude of gratefulness. That man planted the field, but God produced the harvest. And that in the simple closeness to nature, these people lived very quiet lives. Divorce was extremely rare among them. Crime almost unknown. Ambition largely deficient. Once in a great while, one of the farmer's many sons would go to the city in search of fame and fortune. But for the most part, life at that time was still a comparatively simple existence for these people. Their religion took care of their doubts, and their farms took care of their exercise. Also, there was a certain sense of constant fulfillment. The pride of the family was its growing children. And when a farmer could look out onto the field and see 5 of his own sons working there with him, he was satisfied. He was proud. Everything was right. And when one of the sons married the daughter of a neighbor down the road, close neighbor maybe, 7 miles away, everyone was happy. They'd sort of expected it. The relatives didn't all gather together and try to figure out how such an impossible union had been achieved. It was all right. Everybody liked everybody. And if there were any strangers in the area that nobody liked, they'd moved away long ago. Because you either belonged or you did not belong. And that was all there was to that. So in this type of situation, apparently you had lack of nerve tension, lack of the stress of circumstances. And I was talking to an old Swedish doctor some time ago whom I have known for a number of years, and he said, I think one of the reasons people have trouble dietetically is because Nerve tension prevents the proper digestion of food. The nerve requirements of the individual call on only certain parts of the nutritional intake. And because the individual is a bundle of nerves, he is forever feeding nerves. He's a nerve feeder. And because his bodily needs are never recognized properly, the food problem becomes a matter of unbalanced chemistry. A chaos sets up in the very processes of assimilation. And, of course, the more nervous we become, the more difficult the problem of elimination becomes, and little by little we are trapped in a hopeless situation. To meet this situation, there can be and must be certain disciplines imposed by the person. Yet we can say, and it is perfectly truthful, that it is very difficult to break down the tensions under which the person has to live at this time. He lives in a world that is tense. He lives in a world in which his own problems and his own affairs seem to require constant tension. If he is not forever mindful of the abnormalities of life around him, he is liable to be engulfed in situations which he cannot cope with. Therefore, he feels that whatever he is doing is simply a form of stimulant to keep him going a little longer, and by the time that stimulant is gone, he must have more to keep him going until he can solve something which, incidentally, he seldom, if ever, actually solves. Under these conditions, the pattern of nutrition is bound to be as bad as anything else. The same kind of pressures that are resulting in a rapid increase in crime, the kind of pressures that result in 1.5 million automobile accidents a year involving private cars, all these pressures have to do with attitudes, and attitudes react into our most common ways of life. They react into our home life, into our exercise patterns, into our nutritional patterns, into our mental and emotional avocational patterns. Every part of our daily existence is disturbed by the pressures under which we live at the present time. Now, to make a diagnosis of this kind is, of course, rather trite, because the average person probably will agree and say, so what? We have them, what are we going to do about them? And the same problem arises that we face with every situation that comes along. So we have high blood pressure. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to continue to have it? Are we going to say there is nothing we can do about it? Or are we going to take some kind of a pill for it, which perhaps will lower our blood pressure and cause us in the end to die of a deteriorated liver? Whatever we figure, what are we going to do about it? Now, if it was true, and most people believe it is true, that there is nothing you can do about anything, then we might just as well hold our nose and sink. There's nothing else we can do. We can go down as the old flagship went down, with the flag nailed to the mast, and on the flag written the words, I object. But at the same time, we go down. Now, if it were true that there was nothing we could do about it, then I would say we might as well eat ourselves to death as anything else. It's perhaps a little more pleasant than some other forms of problem. It certainly was more pleasant than the hemlock which Socrates drank. But there might be answers to some of these things, but these answers in turn do depend upon the individual having some firm resolution to improve, or to correct, or to adjust, or to free himself from some of these pressures that are burdening him all the time. If he is in the midst of a situation and says, there's nothing I can do about it, then it's finished as far as he is concerned. But if he says there must be an answer of some kind, I will look for it, then perchance something can be accomplished. Now, in this matter of our personal adjustment with society at the present moment, something can be accomplished. But it can only be accomplished by an individual who is willing to gather his resources and apply some common sense to the problems under which he lives. There is no use hoping that he is going to be able to cure this difficulty by a sedation of some nature. Nor is there any reason to suppose that the annual intake of aspirin is particularly solutional of anything. Certainly, it helps an individual through a momentary crisis, but the more he takes of it, the more consistent the crisis will become, and the more he will have to take of it. And finally, he will injure his own nature, and the crisis will become chronic. Thus, there is no real solution in these directions. The individual is bound to society and to the problem of his time by a series of subconscious agreements within his own nature. Before he can become completely overwhelmed by the world in which he lives, he has to admit himself defeated. He has to take the attitude that the only way that he can survive is to make the same mistakes that other people make. If he comes to this conclusion, then for him it is going to be a round of tranquilizers and stimulants. But if he is not willing to accept this defeat, if he insists that he is still the master of his own destiny, regardless of how things appear to be, then there are things that can be done, steps that he can take, which will help him to solve problems. If, for example, his problem has to do with food intake in any of its forms, if he is allergic to certain foods, if he's trying to reduce, if he's trying to put on weight, if he's trying to escape from some type of dyspepsia, if his eating is destroying his peace of mind, then there are things that he can do if he wants to. Actually, in most of these problems, up to a certain degree, the individual is his own physician. He is his own physician until a problem reaches a point where it is beyond his own knowledge or ability to handle it. Being his own physician does not mean to be his own faddist, nor does it necessarily mean that he is to be his own physician only because he experiments with the things he reads in the paper. To be his own physician means to possess within himself the common sense to do those common sense things which, if done, will probably relieve him of a large part of his trouble. The highest of all arts is common sense. We are born with it and we lose it gradually throughout life. But we have to sometimes reclaim it and try to find out why we are in certain troubles that we are in at the present time. In the last 25 years, particularly, our Western civilization has become so tremendously status conscious that we are now willing to sacrifice anything in terms of reality for almost anything else in terms of appearances. We have become worshippers of appearance. We accept other people on the basis of appearance. We like to believe they're honest because they look prosperous. We like to believe they are our friends because they tell us they are. We like to hope a great deal from people, and also we like to expect a great deal from ourselves without any particular reason for such optimism. In sober fact, we are becoming utterly appearance dominated. It is an appearance fixation. We have, in this sense, sacrificed something which we can ill afford to sacrifice. There is really no difference between an individual using some kind of an artificial drug in order to regulate one appetite and his insistence on trying to be important by looking important. The whole process of using our physical appearance to justify or assure our success in every bracket of living, this is just plain stupidity. but we do not know how to break away from it. We assume that if we try to be different, we will be penalized, that we won't enjoy all the things that other people enjoy. But we look around us rather critically and we say, what are they enjoying? And for the most part, nothing. This status problem is not ending in some people having a grand time. It is ending in all of these people being up to their neck in trouble, some of them a little deeper. It means that this whole problem of status is producing nothing. It is producing internationally a horrible mess. The idea of the great, rich, and prosperous country being the leader of the world is getting us all into more trouble every minute. The idea that we are the richest and best equipped people in the world, instead of resulting in mutual admiration, is making everybody else hate us. And this is very largely the problem of status. The more of the outside virtues we try to cultivate, the fewer friends we have, the less security we have, and the poorer the level of respect from persons whose respect we might really want to enjoy. So status and all these problems fit together to maintain an artificial way of life, a way of life that is so essentially impossible that it affects all of our natural, biological, and psychological functions, disrupts them, and forces us to continuously do things that are wrong in order to appear to be contemporary. Well, it's all right to appear to be contemporary, but if we look at the contemporary situation, we find it is not much worth perpetuating. There's nothing so good about it that we can get wildly enthusiastic. Most of the contemporary situation is bad. It is leading to more and more delinquency. It is piling up divorce rates. It is creating constant dissatisfaction among people. It is interfering with relationships on all fields of industry and economics. And out of the whole sad picture, we find the stock exchange falling apart in front of us, all due to a way of life that we are desperately trying to make work, and which will not work simply because there's no truth in it and never was. If, therefore, in our life we want to try to be like this false world, then it is up to us to make the same mistakes all other people make, and we will enjoy the same miseries exactly. Ends and causes are always in ratio to each other. But why we should feel that something that has never worked in the history of man is going to be a success because we do it, this is a mystery that no one has been able to explain. So if you want to try to get away from the troubles that other people are in, you're going to have to in some way inhibit your instinct to make the same mistakes that they make. Because if you do, you will have the troubles and there's nothing you can do about it. If you have decided in your own mind that there are things that you can do about it, you can sit down and survey your life. And you can say to yourself, if there were no such things as dominant trends, if there were no such things as progressive fashions, if there was no such a thing as style tyranny, and it was a kind of a nice, quiet world, what would I do about some of these things? Would I keep on doing the things that I'm doing? If I wasn't afraid of my neighbor's opinion, if I wasn't afraid of my job, if I wasn't afraid that I would seem separate, different, or eccentric, what would I really do? How would I live if I could live the way I feel I would like to live? This might result in a number of discoveries. It might result in a gradual modification of prevailing policies which contribute to sickness and death. We might find that we don't need also the tremendous economic pressures which are required to provide us with the various things that are actually hurting us. It seems a terrible thing to have to spend good money to make yourself sick, and yet millions of people are doing it every day. And even though money is comparatively cheap today, getting well is still rather expensive. And to say nothing of the source of misery and concern in our own natures. So if we have courage to do things that are right, we can very largely correct the false pressures that have to do with the situations in which we find ourselves. If we give the body a chance, if we give the emotions an opportunity and the mind the right and privilege of normal function, I think we will find that the so-called excessive appetites or desires which affect us will gradually diminish to controllable degree. We will find that we are not being constantly forced and pressed. We will discover that we do not need the quantities of food that we thought we needed. Or if we find that we need them, we find that the body can take care of them, and therefore that our health gradually smooths out. And we settle down to perhaps what I have always held to be an archetypal concept of weight. Now, our statistics tell us that persons who are overweight will not last as long as people who are underweight. This may be true, but I think there is another factor in this whole picture that has been ignored. Namely, that in most instances, or many instances, overweight is due to one of three things. First, it can be and sometimes is due to glandular abnormalcy, in which the glandular system is in some way defective or is not in its best condition, and up to the present time there is no actual cure for major glandular imbalance. Some minor forms can be improved, but it is still admittedly too dangerous to try to control glandular function by X-ray and things of this nature. It is very, very much more likely to cause other trouble. Consequently, by glandular problem, the individual may be faced with certain situations which cannot easily or immediately be controlled. The second thing is that your weight problem can result from a very poor psychological integration. It can be an evidence of many defeatisms and pressures within the personality itself. It can bear witness, therefore, to unsuspected possible causes for other ailments. That instead of being entitled to say the individual is overweight, therefore his life expectancy is undermined, it might be wiser to say the individual is overweight, therefore he is suffering from psychological pressures which will shorten his life. It is not at all certain that the overweight is the cause, but only a symptom, one of several symptoms of a lack of psychological integration which can result in a shortening of life. Also, the overweight may or may not be due to over food intake. Some persons who have more trouble with overweight than perhaps their neighbors ever speculated upon are small eaters. And some people who are underweight are absolutely incessant compulsive eaters. Therefore, it is not certain that food intake is the secret of weight. Food chemistry has something to do with this. It is also true that individuals who have small food intake are very apt to be nibblers, and nibbling can cause trouble. In many instances, however, the overweight problem is one of several symptoms which can result in possible shortening of life. It is also true that the correction of the overweight itself may not in any way assure the individual an extension of life probability. But if this is accomplished, if this reduction is accomplished by greater and personal integration, by which the individual, taking hold of his life, begins to practice a stronger discipline over all of his habits, this discipline, rather than the reduction in the food, is apt to lengthen his life. There are more elements in this than we realize, but modern thinking, particularly modern science, is determined, if possible, to neglect the philosophic implication or even the religious content in any conduct pattern which may exist. But we cannot so faithfully agree with this, that in most cases the individual is not merely suffering from symptoms. He is suffering from causes which produce symptoms. And without in some way changing the causes, he is not going to change the symptom. All in all, the human body is a great lover of simplicity. All the functions of the body, all of the health of the body is improved by quiet, integrated living. The body can stand a great deal of work, but very little beating. It can stand a great deal of effort, but very little tension. It can carry responsibility for a long lifetime, but worry will get it quick. Nearly every abnormal pressure that we put upon the body will injure it. The body is capable of sustaining our needs and our gracious living for a long time, but it is not capable of standing dissipation, various forms of pressure, tremendous mood swings, and things of this nature. And if we are suffering to a certain degree from the food that comes into the body from the outside, we are also suffering from the type of psychic chemistry that comes to the body from the inside, and which is constantly endangering its material function. The body, whipped from the inside, develops symptoms and pressures and demands which we try to meet by crowding it with food from the outside. Nothing is accomplished, and we have only fooled ourselves. The best way, then, to ensure a reasonable length of life is to try to bring the life pattern, as far as its physical concerns are, into harmony with the needs of the physical body of man. Our changes in industry and automation, our development of wonder drugs and wonder chemicals, the speeding up of automobiles, and the sudden influx of high-rise apartment houses will have no effect upon body chemistry, except perhaps to complicate living a little bit more. These problems around us cannot be allowed to take total possession of our interests, our activities, and our moods. We have to keep the body simple. We have to keep its pressures low. We have to keep it in a state of, as nearly as possible, continuous relaxation. Now, a relaxed body is not an immovable one. An individual has come to the conclusion now that there is only agitation and sleep, that there is only something every minute, or exhaustion. Such is not the case at all. A relaxed body is not one that simply sits and rocks or gives up rocking because that is too much tension. The relaxed body is one in which there is no artificial pattern of resistances. A relaxed body is one in which nature has been given the blessed privilege of having its own way within the processes over which nature has absolute rulership. A relaxed body is one in which the mind is not forever telling the body what to do, when the mind hasn't that slightest idea, in most cases, what the body ought to do. If we were actually able intellectually to control body function, we'd all be dead by the time we were 10 years old. It is only that these things are out of our conscious control for the most part that we even survive. To say nothing of the fact that we would have 50 different schools as to how we should run the liver. This situation is unthinkable. If, however, we permit the body to take care of itself, we give it the proper attention that it naturally requires, it will serve us, and we will hardly know that we have it. We will not even have to be thoughtful or mindful of it particularly. All we have to do is allow it to have those things which it needs in the way in which it needs them. Its own natural appetites, freed from artificial ones, will gradually set in and tell us what is necessary, but not if we constantly distort these appetites by our own actions. Once this body is quietly allowed to exist, we will discover much more that the freedom of the mental and emotional life of man is attained. The mind, no longer tied up in a sick or tense body, has its own life relieved, freed, and smoothed out. The same with the emotions. If physical irritations were removed from our mental and emotional life, we would have a 25% improvement in our mentality immediately. If, on the other hand, the mental and emotional pressures were taken off of the body, we would probably have a 50% improvement in health. These two groups of factors are hurting each other all the time. And they will continue to hurt each other until we finally arbitrate these differences. There is no use of doing the same thing we're trying to do between the free world and the communist world, maintain some kind of an uneasy state of near health by constant armament against the invasion of the opposite phases of our own lives. If we really want to get something out of this problem, which we call living, we should learn something from the daily experiences through which we pass and the common remembrance of our people, and do what we can to make this thing work out. You can start wherever you want to, in the problem of your own personality. But if your personality is complex, it has to be simplified or you will be sick. Now, some people will admit under pressure that they were born with highly nervous temperaments, and this we know is true. There are some persons that are born with much more sensitivity and much more probability of becoming neurotic than other people. There are some who seemingly are born introverts, others born extroverts. Some individuals are going to worry from the cradle to the grave, and others are not going to give a serious thought to anything while they live. These oppositions, these tremendous extreme cases, we know to be perhaps a little more common than we like to realize. But for the most part, these extreme cases have to be left to the tender guidance of nature. Nature will ultimately balance this thing, but we cannot. But for the average person whose life is a mixture of factors, a great deal can be done if he will start anywhere. He must start doing something. The common symptoms on which we base the need for urgency will be simple problems such as poor digestion, the dear old industrial status ulcer, poor elimination, frequent headaches and difficulties of this nature, very bad and sudden changes in blood pressure, difficulty in respiration, minor symptoms of heart ailments, and, on the psychological basis particularly, the rapid increase of our habits of worry, fear, antagonism, or the development of some strong negative fixation or complex whereby in intensifying attitude we are making enemies, losing friends, and destroying happiness. Any of these things showing up indicate an immediate need for a lot of careful thinking. If we try to solve any of these things simply with a sedation or a tranquilizer or some kind of a drug to cause us to forget that we're sick, we're ultimately going to have to wake up again and find that we are sick. And in the meantime, the sickness has had a splendid opportunity to dig more deeply into our subconscious natures. And we now have a further compound problem because we not only have to get over the sickness, but we have to get over a powerful chemical drug, which may be also by this time hard at work killing us. So we are faced with numerous difficulties. The simple way is to realize that we have a choice in this world. We can, if we so desire, shorten life, make it miserable, enjoy a great deal of sickness in the closing years, and end in a comparative tragedy. We can do this, and all we have to do in most instances is keep on making the mistakes that we have been lovingly making for the greater part of our lives. If, however, we're a little tired of this, and would like to perhaps see if we can't prepare some better destiny than this, then we can start wherever it just looks as though we have a problem which shows up and needs immediate attention. We have to have something inside, however, to do this with. So if we are going to be good, staunch materialists, we're going to have trouble all the way along, because we will have nothing to work with. If, however, we're willing to suspect there might be something worthwhile in the universe, at least we have a little point on which we can build something. But we really need to make our own help available to us. We need a little philosophy and some good solid religion. Without these, we're not going to get well. The world isn't going to get well. And the individual is not going to get over his own troubles. No amount of science can do for man what his own faith can do. Science with faith can do much. Science without faith can do little. Faith without science can do a great deal, but faith with science can do still even more. So these proportions have to be remembered. To begin then, we start with trying to gather our resources. We say to ourselves, it is humanly possible for any human being to control himself. And this self-control is the final status symbol, and the only one that means anything. The fact that we have more clothes in the closet than any other man on earth means nothing, and will not save us from one ache or pain, nor will it give us one true friend. But if we have a little more self-control than our neighbor, this is a final sense of status. For as Confucius so clearly pointed out, the superior person, and status is essentially superiority, the superior person is simply the individual who is capable of controlling his own life in conformity with universal law. This is the superior person. Anything that we deck out on the outside is of no value. It's like hanging the tinsel on the Christmas tree, and a week later the Christmas tree is out back to be taken away by the trash collector. There is nothing on the outside that will stick and will actually change the person. So true status begins when we realize that it is possible for the person to put his own life in order. We all have the possibility. We all have the means necessary unless we are actually mentally deficient or mentally ill. There are certain degrees of mental illness in which we lose the power to direct our own destiny. There are certain degrees of morality in which we do not possess that power. But 99% of the population of the earth can control itself if it wants to. To control oneself is to begin the process of putting together the elements of life into an harmonious pattern. And the moment we begin to bring life into harmony, the tendency to excess of any kind is diminished. As the mind becomes a little wiser, the tendency to emotional excess is reduced. As the emotions become a little nobler, the tendency to mental excess is reduced. And when mind and emotion become better integrated, the tendency to physical excess is reduced. Excess is always reduced by intelligence, by the proper application of the mind and emotions to their normal purposes and projects. Excess is reduced. Not because we have fought against excess, but because we have posited normalcy. Because we have made right the purpose and way of life. That which is not right falls away of itself. If we get a little more philosophy, an understanding of life, we will have more patience, more appreciation of value, less fear, less worry, less doubt, less suspicion. And as these are reduced, you will find that the compulsive eater will not eat as much. If on the emotional level we are able to cultivate a greater sense of value, if we motivate with our emotions only constructive attitudes, if through our emotional stability we overcome our tendency to jealousy, to various conspiracies, to hates, to revenges, to all these envious things which have dominated us, if our emotional life is freed gradually from these excesses and brought under the reign of reason, then we will also find that we will be less subject to compulsive cosmetic thinking. We will be less dominated by meaningless styles and even dangerous practices, and by further extension, the body has a chance to relax, use its natural functions, the body chemistry improves, and the processes which cause foods to become too rapidly transformed into fat-forming materials, these processes will no longer act in this extreme manner. We've got to get the pressures off of the body. And the only way we can get them off of the body is by causing these pressures to come under some form of enlightened self-directive. Also, we note that it is our emotional and mental processes which, gradually affecting the body, will inevitably reduce its resistance to disease. There is a relationship between health and conduct. The individual whose conduct is bad will ultimately be sick. This sickness may or may not immediately appear, but it will ultimately affect adversely the life of the individual. And many problems in health today, which we regard as terrible physical problems, are actually a continuing testimony to the fact that we have made life too complex, that we have involved ourselves in a situation which is too pressureful for us, and in all this process of complicating living, we have not produced within ourselves the faculties to control this complexity. So that instead of having a way of life which is enriching us, it is impoverishing us because we cannot handle it. We have put too much weight upon the development of external things, and too little attention has been given to preparing ourselves to cope with these external things. As a result, we're in trouble. Now, we can't change the world, but we can all change ourselves. And by degrees, we can create a kind of individuality which I do not think we will find as objectionable as many people seem to feel that it will be. If most of you can remember back perhaps 25 or 30 years ago, we still had in human society a number of individuals. They were delightful people. They were delightful because they were not like everybody else. We realize that there was a great delight about such men, for instance, as Mark Twain. Well, Mark Twain was an individual. Today we have an actor impersonating him and people paying good solid money to see how Mark Twain acted when he was an individual. We remember that we had individuals in many fields of life. We had intellectuals who were individuals. Perhaps they wore their hair down to their waist in the back, but so what? They were people. They had the courage to do it. We don't. Some, not too long ago, a very famous Greek artist came to the United States, a very charming, dignified, refined lady. She arrived in New York in a homespun garment of pre-Christian Greek cut. She wore the clothing of ancient Greece and sandals. And she was a very wealthy and important and impressive woman, and as far as we can learn, she didn't lose a single social engagement as a result of eccentric attire. She told the New York press very simply, she said, when the time comes and I have to wear high-heeled shoes, I'm going to the South Sea Islands. I don't care. They're not healthy and they're not comfortable and I won't wear them. This was rugged individualism. But she was perfectly right. And everybody enjoyed it. She was not exiled from society. In fact, everybody wanted her to come so they could see her. Here was a person. You could find all the conformists you want. But a rugged individual is an addition to any social occasion. But it wasn't the clothing that kept her going. It was the fact that she was an important person in her own right. She had her own mind and she used it. She was accomplished, talented, a leader in her own society. And no one worried about it in the slightest. But today, our desperate fear is that we might be different. We don't dare be different. There are two horrible things we cannot face. One is that we are different, and the other is that two of us are caught with the same clothes on. This is a social faux pas. They must not be different, but they must not be the same, and that enough in itself is a problem that's enough to cause destruction. So out of all of this kind of thinking comes a little good Zen, comes a little good artistry of philosophy and things of this nature. We can be different. But to be different, we must be different all the way. We must be different in a superior way. The beatnik is different, but that doesn't count very highly in his favor, because he is different by pessimism only. He is different by rebellion against something. Whereas true difference or individuality is the achievement or growth of something within our own natures, by means of which we have a right to be an individual. We have lost all this individuality. We're not producing men like Edison or Alexander Graham Bell. We are not producing men like Steinmetz or Mark Twain or Rudyard Kipling, individuals. We are producing now group motions. We consider this good. But as long as we have this group thinking, we are imposing identical habits upon bodies that are not identical. We are imposing identical thought patterns upon minds which were created to be individual. And we are imposing identical emotional demands upon psychic integrations which have as their purpose the cooperation with and support of individuality. We are trying to make people alike who were created to be different. We are trying to penalize difference. We are trying to measure difference in terms of superiority and inferiority with conformity the golden norm. Conformity is the thing we got out of when we became individuals. Cattle conform. The creatures that do not have individual intellect conform, and we regard them as inferior. Man gained a mind in order that he could be an individual, so that he would no longer be properly included under the general heading of a flock of sheep. And gradually, in the course of a highly specialized industrial civilization, we have forced a conformity upon each other and upon ourselves. Now, this conformity is, however, not being imposed upon non-intelligent herd creatures who do their best under conformity. It is being imposed upon creatures that for 1,000,000 years or more have been struggling desperately to become individuals. And now, not because individuality is bad, but because individuality is inconvenient in a system of regimented activity, we penalize individuality. We penalize it religiously, culturally, educationally, industrially. We penalize it in terms of policy. We penalize it in every phase of life. So we are constantly trying to take people and fit them into situations they do not fit into. And we are going to have, then we do have the same kind of misery that inevitably results when we try to fit all feet into one size shoe, or insist upon the fact that all individuals must eat the same food, think the same thoughts, feel the same feelings, and weigh the same within 10 ounces or a pound. Nature didn't intend it that way. Or if nature did, it was a total failure as far as nature was concerned, because it has never worked out that way. Rather, it has worked out that the individual, as Buddha said, is a refuge unto himself, a law unto himself, and an island unto himself. And on this island, or in this little world of his own life, the individual must learn to do what is good for him, insofar as he can do this without injuring any other person, and the internal life of the individual can be regulated without interfering with the external life of anyone else. Simply a matter of taking hold of these problems and using them. The purpose in each case being that the individual shall find out what is good for him. One simple way is to be observant of what happens to him. He can go to a doctor, and the doctor can physically perhaps find out the present situation of the body of that person to a reasonable degree. But this doctor cannot tell us what our own thoughts are, what our own feelings are, cannot tell us the secrets of our backgrounds, cannot tell us the exasperations and desperations which lurk within our psychic content. We are the only one in the world who knows these things. Even if we pay an analyst thousands of dollars, he cannot know as much about us as we know about ourselves. And he cannot find out as much about us as we can find out if we become thoughtful, honest, and observant. Out of a little internal integration, therefore, around these core points, we can gradually learn what is good for ourselves. And having found out, we can do one of two things: benefit from what we've learned and enjoy certain securities, or ignore what we've learned and get into trouble. But if we do ignore and do get into trouble, we have no right to blame anyone but ourselves. On this kind of a basis, we'll find that diet is not an isolated subject, but it is part of a universal philosophy as has been taught from the beginning of time, and that it's just as much a phase of our total nature as our complexion, the color of our hair, or whether we wish to be Platonists or Buddhists. All of these together make patterns. And if we can pull a pattern together into some kind of order, we will enjoy comparative security. If we cannot pull the pattern together, if we have to live in chaos, then this chaos will reveal itself in our physical lives. We will either be too heavy or too thin, or regardless, we may even be normal weight and have the sicknesses that are still forced upon us by the intemperances of our psychic integration. So it's a matter of pulling the personality and the temperament into a common working team. For in the world, cooperation is the life of trade, and in man, cooperation is the cause of health. The cooperation of the parts of the personality will assist us to meet the emergencies of the day with a greater assurance. We can meet with greater relaxations those responsibilities we must face, and we will stop creating false emergencies through which we must fight with psychic tension. Little by little, if we want to, we can pull the pattern together, and when tension is lowered within ourselves, almost any destructive habit which we may have will fall away or decline of itself until it becomes a negligible factor in our total economy. This is what the ancients taught us, and I think they were pretty nearly right, and I hope we get back to it one of these days. Well, thank you kindly. Time's up. Our subject next Sunday morning has to do with hypnotic therapy, and we hope that you will find it interesting and that you will all be with us. The little gift shop, which is the extension of the library extension, will be open after the lecture this morning, and we have some rather interesting Chinese and Japanese books for sale. They're in English, but they have to do with Chinese Oriental philosophy, a little with Zen and Buddhism and Oriental poetry and things like that. They're wonderful little gift books to take the place of a card or small gift. Of course, and as we have always told you in connection with literature, a gift book is always a nice gift because you read it first and then give it away. It's sort of a double usage, which is always helpful. This morning we called your attention also our book, Healing the Divine Art, which has much to do with the subjects we talked about this morning. The PRS library will be open for a short time today after the lecture for the benefit of those who have not seen the old Chinese block bindings and so forth, together with art objects and on display in the various cases and walls of the library. So you're welcome to come in, but the friends this week have their own meeting after the lecture so that the usual activities will be somewhat curtailed. In July, we plan a brand new exhibit, which will be quite extensive and quite interesting, and will have a lot of whimsy and chuckle to it, so that we hope you will all plan to visit our library during the month of July when this is established. Don't forget also our subject on hypnotic therapy next Sunday morning. We thank you for being with us and hope to see you again next week.